Some children aren't abandoned on the street. They're pushed out by their own parents at their most vulnerable, pregnant at 16, with nowhere to go and no one to stand beside them. Forced to survive, to raise a child alone, to build a life from nothing, while the very people who should have protected them disappear without a trace. And then years later, when success finally comes, those same people return, not with regret, but with a lawsuit. People often say, family is everything you forgive no matter what. But when family is the first to walk away, what happens when they come back only because there's something to take? Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next twist in this journey. Now, let's listen to her from the heart. I remember the way the courtroom smelled that morning, polished wood paper, something faintly sterile that never quite leaves a place where people come to argue over truth. I sat at my table in Richmond, Virginia, hands resting flat against the surface, steady in a way they hadn't always been. Across the aisle stood my parents. Gerald and Monica Vance looked composed, well-dressed, confident. My mother leaned slightly toward their attorney, whispering something with a small smile, the kind she used to wear when she thought she had everything under control. My father stood beside her arms, stiff at his sides, nodding occasionally as if already rehearsing victory in his mind. They looked like people who believed they had already won. I watched them in silence, and what struck me most wasn't anger. It wasn't fear either. It was distance. As if I were watching strangers who just happened to share my last name. My hands stayed still on the table. Grounded, controlled, nothing like the girl I used to be. The girl I was 20 years ago. Back then my hands trembled. Back then I didn't sit in courtrooms. Back then I stood on a porch with nowhere to go. It was late October in a small town tucked into the hills of West Virginia. The kind of night where the air cuts through your clothes, where the wind doesn't just blow, it presses against you, reminding you how small you are. Inside our house, the lights were warm, but the warmth stopped there. My mother sat at the kitchen table, arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was holding herself together. She didn't look at me. Not really. Her eyes hovered somewhere near my shoulder, as if meeting my gaze would make everything too real. My father paced behind her back and forth, his footsteps sharp against the hardwood floor. No one raised their voice. That was the worst part. I had just told them I was pregnant. I remember standing there waiting, hoping maybe for something. Anger, shock, anything that sounded like they still cared enough to feel. Instead, I got silence. Cold, measured, final. "You embarrassed us?" My mother said, her voice flat, controlled, as if she were commenting on the weather. My father stopped pacing just long enough to add, "You ruined everything." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. I wanted to explain. I wanted to say I was scared, that I didn't know what to do, that I needed them. But there was no space for that. No opening, no invitation. My mother's next words closed whatever door had been left. "Pack your things," she said. "You're leaving tonight." That was it. No argument, no discussion, no second chance, just a decision already made. I stood there for a second too long, waiting for someone, anyone, to change their mind. But my father had already turned away. My mother had already looked down at the table like the conversation was over. So I went to my room. I remember every detail of that moment in a way that feels almost cruel. The way my bed looked untouched, like it belonged to someone else. The posters on the wall, the small things that suddenly didn't matter anymore. I didn't have a suitcase, just a plastic grocery bag. I moved slowly at first, then faster, grabbing whatever I could, clothes, a toothbrush, anything that felt like it might help me survive the next day. My hands shook as I stuffed things inside, not because I didn't understand what was happening, but because I understood it too well. I wasn't being punished. I was being erased. When I walked back through the house, neither of them stopped me. My father stood near the window. My mother remained at the table, her arms still crossed, her posture unchanged. I paused by the door, just for a second, waiting, hoping. But no one called my name. No one told me to stay. So I opened the door and stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and unforgiving. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, clutching that thin plastic bag like it was the only thing tethering me to something real. Behind me, the door closed, not slammed, just closed. Soft. Final. I stood there on the porch, staring out into the dark, and something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to understand one thing with absolute clarity. I didn't have a family anymore. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet. There was only one place left that felt even remotely like an option. Eleanor, my grandmother. I adjusted the strap of the bag on my shoulder and started walking, each step pulling me further away from the life I had known and closer to something I couldn't yet name. I didn't know what would happen next. I only knew one thing. From that moment on, survival was no longer a possibility. It was a requirement. By the time I reached Eleanor's house, my hands were numb from the cold. The small porch light was on, casting a soft yellow glow over the front steps. Her house sat quietly at the edge of the road, surrounded by a modest garden. She kept alive year-round, even when the weather tried to kill it. It didn't look like much to anyone else, but to me it looked like the only place left in the world that might still open its door. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering near the door, unsure of what I would even say. How do you explain something like this? How do you tell someone your own parents decided you didn't belong anymore? In the end, I didn't say anything at all. I just knocked. The sound felt too loud in the silence. A few seconds passed, then I heard movement inside, slow, steady footsteps approaching. The door opened, and there she was, Eleanor Vance. She looked at me, just once. Her eyes moved from my face to the bag in my hand, then back again. It couldn't have taken more than a second, but in that second, something shifted in her expression. Not shock, not confusion, understanding. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask why I was there. She simply stepped aside and said softly, "Come in, baby." That was it. No questions, no judgment, just a door opening. The warmth hit me as soon as I crossed the threshold, not just from the house itself, but from something deeper, something I hadn't felt all night. Safety. I didn't even realize how tense my body had been until it started to give out. My shoulders dropped. My grip on the bag loosened. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry. Not yet. Eleanor closed the door behind me without another word. She took the bag from my hand gently, as if it were heavier than it looked, and guided me down the hallway. She didn't rush me, didn't press me. She just moved with quiet certainty, like she already knew what I needed before I could say it. The guest room was small but clean. Fresh sheets, a lamp glowing softly on the nightstand, a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, the kind she'd probably made herself years ago. "Sit," she said. I did. She disappeared for a moment and came back with a mug of tea, placing it in my hands. The warmth seeped into my fingers, grounding me in a way nothing else had all night. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and stayed quiet. That silence meant more than anything she could have said. No lectures, no disappointment, just presence. For the first time since I'd spoken those words at my parents' kitchen table, I felt something other than fear. I felt held. Days turned into weeks. Eleanor never pushed me to explain everything at once. She let the story come out in pieces when I was ready. And when I did tell her, she listened, really listened, without interrupting, without correcting, without making it about herself. She drove me to doctor's appointments in her old truck, the one that rattled every time it started. She made sure I ate even when I insisted I wasn't hungry. She spent money she didn't have on things I needed: vitamins, clothes, anything that would help me and the baby. I began to notice the way she saved, The way she clipped coupons carefully, the way she stretched every dollar further than it should reasonably go. At the time, I thought it was just who she was. I didn't realize yet how much of it was for me. As the months passed, my world narrowed. School appointments, the slow, steady reality of what was coming. At night, we'd sit on the porch together, watching cars pass on the distant road. "Think about what you want," she said once, her voice gentle but firm. "Not just tomorrow. Later." I stared out into the dark, struggling to picture anything beyond survival. "I just want my baby to have something better," I said finally. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "You will," she said. There was no doubt in her voice, and somehow that made me believe it. When the time came, everything happened fast. The hospital was small, the lights too bright, the air filled with that strange mix of urgency and routine. Nurses moved around me, voices overlapping instructions coming from every direction. But through it all, Eleanor was there, right beside me, steady, unmoving. When my son was finally placed in my arms, everything else faded. The noise, the fear, the past, all of it. He was small, warm, real, Ethan. I looked down at him, and something inside me broke open, not in pain, but in clarity. For the first time, I understood exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just my life anymore. It was his. Tears slipped down my face before I could stop them. Eleanor leaned in her hand, resting gently on my shoulder. "You did it, baby," she whispered. "You're a mother now." I nodded, unable to speak, because in that moment everything changed. I wasn't the girl my parents had thrown out. I wasn't the mistake they thought I was. I was someone responsible, someone needed, someone who didn't have the option to give up. That night, holding Ethan close, I made a promise I didn't fully understand yet, but I knew I would spend the rest of my life keeping. I would build something. I would create a future. And one day, no one, not even the people who erased me, would ever have the power to make me feel small again. Life didn't slow down after Ethan was born. If anything, it moved faster, just heavier. Our world shrank into Eleanor's small house, a place that always smelled faintly of tea and laundry detergent, where every corner had a purpose, and nothing went to waste. It wasn't big, but it held everything we needed. A crib by the window, a chair that creaked every time I rocked it, a kitchen table that doubled as a desk, a dining space, and sometimes a place to rest my head when I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. My days stopped belonging to me. They belonged to a rhythm I didn't control. Ethan cried, I fed him. He slept, I studied. He woke again, and everything repeated. At night, the house would fall quiet except for the soft sounds of breathing and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. That was when I opened my books. 2 in the morning became my new normal, one hand holding a pencil, the other rocking Ethan gently when he stirred. Sometimes I didn't even realize how tired I was until my vision blurred and the words on the page stopped making sense. But I kept going, because stopping wasn't an option. I enrolled in an alternative high school program that let me keep up while taking care of a newborn. During the day, I went to classes where people whispered just loud enough for me to hear. I could feel their eyes on me before I even sat down. That's her, the pregnant one, the one whose parents kicked her out. No one said it directly, but they didn't have to. The label followed me everywhere. It hung over me like something permanent, something I couldn't shake off no matter how hard I tried. I learned to keep my head down, to finish what I came there to do, to leave without looking back. The grocery store became my second home. I bagged items, stocked shelves, pushed carts across the parking lot under a sky that always seemed either too hot or too cold. My hands stayed busy, my body moving, my mind repeating the same quiet promise over and over. This isn't forever, even when it felt like it might be. But the hardest part wasn't the work. It wasn't the exhaustion or the judgment or the constant pressure pressing against my chest. The hardest part was the silence from the people who were supposed to be there. I could handle strangers whispering. What I couldn't handle, what stayed under my skin, was knowing my own parents had chosen not to. That kind of absence doesn't fade, it settles. One night, long after I thought the house had gone to sleep, I heard Eleanor coughing through the thin wall between our rooms. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, enough to pull me out of the shallow sleep I'd managed to get. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening. It didn't stop right away, and for the first time something shifted inside me. Not fear exactly, but awareness. Eleanor wasn't going to be here forever. Up until then, she had been the constant, the one thing I didn't have to question, the person who caught me when I fell. But lying there in the dark, listening to that quiet, steady cough, I understood something I hadn't let myself think about before. I would have to stand on my own, sooner than I wanted. That realization stayed with me. It followed me into the next day and the next, settling into the back of my mind like a warning I couldn't ignore. A week later, it became something else, something sharper. A man showed up at the house just after noon. I was in the kitchen trying to finish an assignment while Ethan napped in the next room when I heard voices outside. Eleanor had stepped onto the porch. I moved closer to the window just enough to see without being seen. The man was dressed neatly, holding a clipboard, talking fast. Too fast. His voice carried a kind of pressure that didn't sit right. He was telling her the roof needed urgent repairs, that it was dangerous to wait, that if she didn't act now, it would cost her more later. Then he named a number. Too high. I saw the way Eleanor's posture shifted just slightly. Not fear, not exactly, but hesitation. That was enough. I stepped outside. "Is there a problem?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. The man turned toward me, surprised. He looked me up and down quickly, assessing, recalculating. "No problem," he said. "Just helping your grandmother avoid a bigger issue." I nodded once, then stepped closer. "We're not signing anything today." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is time sensitive if you don't leave," I said calmly. "I'll call the sheriff." The change was immediate. The smile dropped. The tone shifted. He muttered something under his breath, turned, and walked off the property without another word. I stood there for a moment, watching him go, my heart pounding harder than I expected. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes sharp, studying. "Well," she said after a second, "that was something." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I just didn't like the way he was talking. She nodded slowly, then said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. "You didn't just not like it," she said. "You knew it was wrong." I didn't answer, but she wasn't finished. "You ever think about law?" she asked. I blinked. Law. "You stood your ground. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't back down." She tilted her head slightly. "That's not something everyone can do." I looked away, unsure what to say, because for the first time I saw it too. Not just survival, something else. Something stronger. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, I sat by his crib and watched him for a long time, his chest rising and falling, steady and peaceful, in a way my own life had never been. I thought about the road ahead, about the weight of everything I was carrying, about the choice in front of me. I could keep going like this, one day at a time, just surviving, or I could do something more. I reached for a pen. The next morning, I enrolled in community college, and for the first time since I stepped off that porch at 16, I wasn't just reacting to what life threw at me. I was choosing where it would go next. Community college didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like stepping into a world I didn't quite belong in. I was older than most of the students in my classes, not by much, but enough. Enough to notice the difference in the way they talked, the way they moved, the way they planned their futures, like time was something they had plenty of. I didn't have that luxury. My life split into 3 parts, student, worker, mother, and none of them ever fully paused for the others. During the day, I sat in classrooms taking notes as fast as I could, forcing my focus to stay sharp even when my body begged for rest. At home, the kitchen table turned into my desk. Again, papers spread out beside bottles and baby blankets. At night, I worked whatever shifts I could get, sometimes at the store, sometimes cleaning offices after hours. Ethan went everywhere with me. There were nights I strapped him to my chest in a sling while I vacuumed empty hallways, the hum of the machine steady beneath his sleeping breath. I'd glance down at him, his face relaxed, and whisper, promises I wasn't sure how to keep yet. One day, I'd say softly, "This is going to be different." The hardest part wasn't the work. It was the feeling of always being slightly out of place. In class, I kept to myself. I didn't have time for conversations that didn't matter. Group projects felt like obstacles more than opportunities. I could feel the way people looked at me sometimes, curious, distant, unsure of where I fit. I didn't fit, and I stopped trying to, because I wasn't there for the same reasons they were. They were building a future. I was trying to escape a past. Money stayed tight in a way that forced decisions no one else seemed to think about. Tuition, groceries, gas, doctor, visits for Eleanor, every dollar had a direction before it even reached my hands. There were moments when I considered cutting back on classes, taking fewer credits, slowing down just enough to breathe. But every time I thought about it, I saw Ethan, and I kept going. There was no backup plan, no safety net, just forward. One night, it caught up with me. I was at the table, books open, notes, half finished the clock, blinking past midnight. Ethan had finally gone down after a long stretch of crying, and the house had settled into that fragile quiet I had learned not to disturb. I told myself I'd just rest my eyes for a second, just a second. The next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of Ethan crying again. My neck ached. My hand was still wrapped around a pen that had left a faint mark across the page. The room was dim, the lamp still on everything exactly as I'd left it except me. I hadn't meant to fall asleep. Before I could move, I heard footsteps. Eleanor. She reached Ethan first, lifting him gently, murmuring something soft I couldn't quite make out. I stayed where I was for a moment, watching a heaviness settling into my chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing her more clearly now. Later, when Ethan was calm again and the house quieted once more, she turned to me. "You're running yourself into the ground," she said, not unkindly. "I'm fine," I answered automatically. She held my gaze a second longer than usual. Then she said, "You don't quit now. Not when you've come this far." Something in her voice stopped me from arguing, because I knew she wasn't just talking about school, she was talking about everything. From that night on, I stopped pretending she would always be the one holding things together. The shift was subtle, but it was there. I started paying closer attention to her health, to the way she moved, to the things she didn't say. I wasn't just the one being supported anymore. I was becoming the one responsible. Time moved. Community college turned into a transfer to a state university. Classes got harder, expectations higher, my schedule tighter. By the time I reached law school, the pace had become something else entirely, relentless. I studied until my eyes burned, drank cheap coffee that did more harm than good, practiced arguments out loud in the bathroom mirror while Ethan did homework in the next room. I didn't have the space to fall behind. And still there were moments I felt it. The gap. The distance between me and everyone else. They had time to network, to socialize, to breathe between deadlines. I had none of that. And for a while, I thought that meant I was at a disadvantage. Until I realized something. They were working towards something they hoped to have someday. I was working for something I couldn't afford to lose. That difference changed everything. When I sat for the bar exam, my hands didn't shake the way they had years before. Not because I wasn't nervous, but because I had already lived through worse. Waiting for the results was harder than the test itself. Every day felt stretched thin with anticipation. Every phone call made my chest tighten. Every passing hour reminded me what was at stake. Then finally, my name appeared on the list. I stared at it for a long time just to be sure. Then I sank to my knees in the living room, the paper trembling in my hands. I didn't shout, didn't celebrate. I just cried. Eleanor came over, slowly lowering herself beside me, wrapping her arms around my shoulders, the same way she had the night I arrived at her door. "You did it," she said softly. And for a moment, everything came full circle. The difference was, this time I wasn't the girl who had nothing left. I was someone who had built something. From nothing at all. By the time I became a public defender, life had stopped feeling like survival and started feeling like something steadier, something I could finally hold in place. Not easy, not comfortable, but stable. We weren't rich, not even close. Every bill still mattered. Every expense still required thought. But we had enough. Enough to keep the lights on. Enough to fix things when they broke. Enough to breathe without counting every dollar like it might disappear overnight. Ethan was older now, taller, quieter in some ways, sharper in others. He had a way of watching things, really watching, that reminded me too much of myself. He'd come home from school with drawings sometimes, stick figures, simple houses, uneven lines that didn't quite stay inside the margins. "Look," he'd say, holding them up. "That's me. That's you. That's Grandma. Always the three of us. Always together." I'd smile, take the paper, and tell him how good it looked, even when the lines wobbled and the proportions didn't make sense. Because the part that mattered wasn't how it looked. It was what it meant. At home, things moved in quiet routines. I'd fix whatever needed fixing, tighten a loose hinge patch, up something on the old car, stretch a paycheck just a little further. Eleanor still clipped coupons like it was a habit she couldn't break. She wore the same coats, kept the same routines, spent as little as possible. At the time, I thought it was just how she lived. I didn't know yet what she was building. The day everything changed started like any other. Ethan had gone outside for a while, restless after school, kicking around in the yard while Eleanor worked in her garden. I was inside sorting through paperwork, letting the quiet settle in. Then I heard him. "Mom." There was something in his voice that cut through everything. I ran. Eleanor was on the ground beside the tomato plants, one hand still pressed into the dirt, her body still in a way that didn't feel right. Ethan stood a few feet away, frozen eyes wide. I dropped to my knees beside her. "Grandma," I said, my voice already shaking. Her skin felt cool, her breathing shallow. Everything moved fast after that, the ambulance, the flashing lights, the ride to the hospital that felt both too short and too long at the same time. The doctors didn't need long. "It's her heart," one of them told me, his voice careful, measured in that way people use, when they know the truth isn't something you want to hear. They explained it in terms I understood, but none of it changed what it meant. There wasn't much time. I sat beside her bed, holding her hand, trying to steady myself in a room that suddenly felt too small for everything it held. She looked at me differently then, not weaker, just finished with pretending everything was fine. "You gave me more years than I ever expected," she said softly. I shook my head immediately. "No, She squeezed my hand just enough to stop me. "I mean it," she said. "You gave me something to stay for." The words landed heavier than anything else that day, because all that time I thought she had saved me. And she had. But I hadn't seen the other side of it. I hadn't realized that I had given her something too. 2 nights later, she was gone. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden shift, just a quiet stillness that settled into the room and didn't leave. The house felt different after that. Not empty, just missing something that couldn't be replaced. Ethan tried to act strong, but I could see it in the way he lingered near her room, the way he looked at her chair, like he expected her to come back and sit in it again. The funeral was small, just the way she would have wanted. But the stories weren't. People came up to me one after another telling me things I had never known. She helped me when I couldn't pay my bills. She brought us food when my husband got sick. She never told anyone, but she paid for my daughter's books. It kept going. Story after story, each one adding another layer to a life I thought I understood. I realized then that Eleanor hadn't just been carrying me. She had been carrying more than I could see. A few days later, I got a call from Howard Klein. "Come by the office," he said. "There are some things we need to go over." I assumed it was paperwork, formalities, the kind of things that come after someone passes. I didn't expect anything more. His office was the same as always, quiet, a little outdated, filled with stacks of paper that looked like they had been there longer than they should have. He sat me down, adjusted his glasses, and opened a folder. "Your grandmother left a will," he said. I nodded. "That makes sense. She named you as her sole beneficiary." I nodded again. Still nothing unusual. Then he turned the folder toward me. "There's more," he said. I looked down at the documents. Numbers, rows of them. Figures that didn't make sense at first. "She sold part of her land years ago," he continued. "Invested the money. Never touched it." I blinked. "What do you mean?" He paused, then said it plainly. "The total comes to approximately $1.6 million. The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet you notice right away, the kind that settles in after something too big to process has already landed. I stared at the page, trying to make the number real. 1.6. I repeated, barely able to get the words out. He nodded. "She wanted you to have security. A future." My hands trembled as I lowered them to my lap. It didn't feel like winning. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like weight. Because I knew exactly what it had cost her. Years of saving. Years of going without. Years of choosing not to spend on herself so that one day I wouldn't have to struggle the same way. I didn't celebrate. I couldn't. Instead, I sat there overwhelmed by the realization that even after she was gone, she was still taking care of me. In the weeks that followed, I didn't rush into anything. I set aside a portion of the money to create a small fund for young mothers' girls, like I had been trying to finish school with no support. I made sure it went somewhere it could matter. The rest I left untouched because it didn't feel like something to spend. It felt like something to protect. I didn't know it yet, but that money wasn't just a gift. It was about to become the reason everything came back. For a while, things were quiet. Not the same kind of quiet as before. This one had a different weight to it. A stillness that came after something had ended, not before something began. I got used to the absence. Slowly, carefully. Eleanor's chair stayed where it had always been. Her things remained untouched. Some nights I'd still expect to hear her footsteps in the hallway, the soft creak of the floorboards under her weight. But the house had changed, and I had to learn how to live in it again. Then my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number at first. I almost let it go to voicemail. But something made me answer. "Hello." There was a pause. Then a voice I hadn't heard in 20 years. "This is your father." Everything inside me tightened. For a second, I couldn't speak. "I heard about your grandmother," he continued. "We should talk." That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just a statement. I didn't respond. I ended the call and stood there staring at the phone like it might explain something it couldn't. 2 days later, the letter arrived. Typed. Formal. Cold. They believed they were entitled to a portion of the estate. They expected it to be transferred. If not, they would pursue legal action. I read it once. Then again. Each word sharper than the last. It didn't take long to understand what this was. They weren't coming back for me. They were coming back for the money. A week later, I saw their car parked outside my house. For a moment, I stayed inside, watching through the window as they stood on the lawn, waiting. Then I stepped out. They looked older, smaller in some ways. But the posture was the same. The certainty. The distance. "We need to talk," my father said, about what I asked, even though I already knew. My mother stepped forward slightly. "You know why we're here?" "I do," I said, and the answer is no. Her expression tightened immediately. "This isn't just about you," she said. "That land belonged to our family, and she chose to leave it to me." My father's jaw clenched. She wasn't in her right mind. The words landed harder than I expected, not because I believed them, but because I knew exactly what they were trying to do. "You're wrong," I said, keeping my voice even. My mother shook her head. "She always favored you. She was manipulated." I took a step back, not out of fear, but to create space. She made her decisions long before she got sick. They didn't listen. They didn't want to. They had already decided how this would go. "We're not leaving without resolving this," my father said. "Then you'll be standing there for a long time." I turned and went inside, closing the door behind me. 2 days later, the official paperwork arrived. A lawsuit. They were suing me for the entire estate. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor used to slice apples, and let the reality settle in. Ethan stood across from me, reading over my shoulder. "They can't do this," he said. "They can try," I replied. "So what do we do?" I looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time, I didn't see a child. I saw someone who needed to understand what came next. "We fight." The word didn't come from anger, it came from certainty. I reached out to Danielle Cross the next day. She listened carefully as I explained everything, flipping through the documents with a practiced eye. When I finished, she leaned back slightly. "They don't have a case," she said. "You're sure the will is solid? Everything was done properly?" I exhaled slowly, but something in me knew this wasn't going to be simple. Because this wasn't just about the law. It was about everything that had happened before it. The past had finally caught up, and this time I wasn't running from it. The morning of the hearing arrived with a kind of quiet that didn't match what was waiting ahead. The sky over Richmond was pale, almost washed out, as if the day itself hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. I stood at the base of the courthouse steps for a moment longer than necessary, adjusting the sleeve of my jacket, grounding myself in something simple before walking in. Danielle stood beside me, composed as always, her briefcase tucked neatly under her arm. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded. I was, and I wasn't. As we climbed the steps, I could feel it, the weight of everything that had led to this point, pressing against me not as fear, but as memory. The kind that doesn't fade no matter how much time passes. 16, cold porch, a plastic bag. For a moment, it all came rushing back so clearly, it almost felt like I was still there. But I wasn't. I straightened my shoulders and kept walking. Inside the courthouse was already alive with movement. Voices echoed off the walls, footsteps carried across the floors, and people filled the space in a way that made it clear this wasn't just another routine case. Word had spread. People from the old town had come. Some I recognized, some I didn't. Their faces carried a mix of curiosity, sympathy, and something harder to define. They weren't just watching a legal dispute. They were watching a story unfold. Danielle and I moved through the hallway and into the courtroom. I took my seat, placing my hands flat on the table in front of me, feeling the cool surface beneath my palms. Steady. Across the room, Gerald and Monica stood with their attorney. They looked confident, put together, certain. My mother leaned toward Victor Langford, saying something that made him nod slightly. My father stood tall, his posture firm, his expression controlled in a way that used to intimidate me. They hadn't changed, or maybe they had, and I was just seeing them differently now. Because for the first time, I didn't feel smaller than them. I just felt separate. The room filled quickly. People took their seats. The low murmur of conversation settled into something quieter, more expectant. Then the side door opened. Victor Langford stepped inside. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from years of practice. His stride measured, his expression calm. Gerald and Monica straightened slightly as he approached both of them, turning toward him with the faintest hint of satisfaction. They expected him to stop, to greet them, to acknowledge them. He didn't. He walked right past them, didn't slow down, didn't even glance in their direction. Instead, he came straight toward me. He stopped just in front of my table, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly. Then he gave a small nod, his voice clear and respectful. "Good morning, Judge." Everything stopped. The room didn't go silent all at once. It happened in layers, like sound being pulled away piece by piece until there was nothing left. I didn't move. I didn't react. I simply held his gaze and gave the slightest nod in return. But across the room, everything had changed. I saw it in my mother's face first, the way her expression froze. her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to understand what she had just heard. Then my father. His shoulders stiffened, his mouth parted just enough to show confusion before it shifted into something else, realization. They turned toward each other briefly, then back toward me, and in that moment the distance between who I had been and who I had become closed completely. They were no longer looking at the girl they had sent away. They were looking at someone they didn't know. Inside, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt something quieter, something final. The hearing began shortly after. Victor Langford stood first, presenting their case with practiced ease. His voice carried clearly through the room as he laid out their argument piece by piece. He spoke of Eleanor's age, of her declining health, of the possibility that she had not been fully aware of her decisions. He suggested influence, manipulation, motive, each word carefully chosen, each sentence built to create doubt. From where I sat, I watched Gerald and Monica. They held themselves steady, but I could see the tension beginning to creep in at the edges. The confidence wasn't as solid as it had been moments before. Then Danielle stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She moved through the evidence with a calm precision that left no room for uncertainty. Medical records, financial documents, witness statements, everything laid out clearly, methodically, without emotion. She was of sound mind, Danielle said. Every step of the process was documented. Every decision was deliberate. The room listened. And then Danielle shifted. She placed another set of documents on the table. These, she said, are records pertaining to my client's history, school files, medical forms, official documentation, proof. She was removed from her home at 16, Danielle continued. Pregnant. Without support. A murmur moved through the room. I kept my eyes forward. Didn't look at them. Didn't need to. Because I already knew what they were feeling. The truth once spoken aloud has a way of filling space in a way nothing else can. Danielle picked up one final document, a letter, handwritten. This was left by Eleanor Vance, she said. Then she read it. She earned a life they tried to deny her. The words settled into the room like something permanent, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. Gerald shifted in his seat. Monica looked down, her hands tightening in her lap. When it was their turn to speak, the structure of their argument began to loosen. My father tried to hold on to it. She left on her own, he said. Danielle responded immediately. She left because she was told to. He hesitated, for just a second, but it was enough. My mother approached it differently. Emotion. Tears. I always loved her, she said, her voice shaking. Danielle didn't interrupt. She waited. Then she asked quietly, Did you call her? My mother's silence stretched. Did you send money? Another silence. Did you meet your grandson? She shook her head. No. The answers weren't spoken loudly, but they didn't need to be. By the time everything had been presented, there was nothing left to argue. The judge reviewed the documents, his expression steady, his voice even when he spoke. This is not a close case, he said. He explained his reasoning clearly. The will was valid. The evidence was consistent. There was no legal basis for the claim. The petition is denied. That was it. No raised voices. No dramatic pause. Just a decision. Gerald and Monica sat still. Victor Langford closed his briefcase slowly. His movements measured professional to the end. Danielle placed a hand lightly on my arm. It's over, she said. I nodded. But as I sat there watching the room begin to empty, I realized something. It wasn't over. Not yet. The courtroom emptied in pieces. Voices faded. Footsteps echoed and then disappeared. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people stood and left, carrying the story with them. I stayed where I was. For a moment. Then another. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy. I rested my hands in my lap and stared at the empty space ahead of me, trying to understand what I felt. There was no surge of victory, no relief, just a kind of stillness that didn't quite settle into anything. Winning hadn't changed what had already happened. It hadn't erased the porch, the cold, the silence that followed me out the door that night. It hadn't reached back far enough to fix any of that. I stood slowly gathering my things and made my way toward the hallway. They were waiting. Gerald and Monica stood near the exit, closer than I expected, as if they had been unsure whether to leave or stay. When they saw me, they didn't move right away. Then my father took a small step forward. He began, then stopped, as if the words didn't come as easily as he had expected. My mother's eyes were red, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "We were wrong," she said. "No defense, no explanation, just that." I looked at them, really looked. Time had changed them. The lines in their faces were deeper, their posture slightly less rigid. The certainty they once carried had worn down into something quieter. They didn't look powerful. They looked tired. We didn't understand. My father added his voice lower now. We didn't know what it would do. I let the silence sit between us for a moment. Then I said calmly, "I needed you when I was a child. Not now." The words didn't come out sharp. They didn't need to. My mother closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders sinking just a little. My father nodded once slowly. There was nothing to argue, nothing to defend, just truth. We stood there like that for a few seconds more, the weight of everything we hadn't said over the years filling the space between us. Then I stepped past them. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. I just kept walking. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter, just clearer. A few days later, a letter arrived, handwritten. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Monica. I sat at the table and opened it carefully. The words were simple. No excuses. No attempts to rewrite anything. Just acknowledgement. They had been wrong. They had let pride decide for them. They didn't expect forgiveness. They only asked for the chance to speak. I folded the letter slowly, setting it down in front of me. For the first time in my life, the choice wasn't being made for me. It was mine. Ethan watched me from across the room. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I leaned back in my chair, considering the question. "I don't know yet," I said. And that was the truth. Because this wasn't about them anymore. It was about what came next. For me. For him. "How you handle it matters," he said after a moment. I looked at him. He wasn't a child anymore. Not really. No matter what he added, it should be your decision. I nodded. He was right. A week later, I agreed to meet them. Not at the house. Not anywhere tied to the past. A diner just outside town. Neutral. Simple. When I arrived, they were already there, sitting across from each other, hands folded on the table like they were waiting for something they couldn't predict. I slid into the booth across from them. No one spoke at first. Then my father cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming." "I almost didn't," I said. My mother nodded. "We understand." We talked. Not about the case, not about the money, about what had happened, what hadn't, what couldn't be changed. There were no raised voices, no arguments, just honesty. By the time we left, nothing had been fixed, but something had shifted. We weren't pretending anymore. That was enough. That evening, I drove out to the cemetery. The sky was fading into soft shades of orange and gray, the air quiet in a way that felt familiar. I walked to Eleanor's grave and placed the flowers gently at the base of the stone. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just stood there. Then quietly, I spoke. "I hope I made you proud." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Because I already knew the answer. What she had given me wasn't just money. It wasn't even security. It was something stronger. The ability to stand, to choose, to move forward without carrying everything that had once tried to break me. I stayed there a little longer, letting the quiet settle around me. Then I turned and walked back to the car. Not because everything was finished, but because I was finally ready to keep going. And maybe what stays after everything settles isn't the verdict or the money or even the words that were finally said. Maybe what stays is something quieter, the realization that we don't always get the family we needed, but we can still become the kind of person we once hoped would show up for us. Not perfect, not untouched, but steady in a way that comes from having walked through it all and still choosing not to harden. We don't always get closure the way we imagine it. Sometimes it doesn't come with a clean ending or a clear answer. Sometimes it looks like a conversation that doesn't fix everything, or a door that isn't fully closed but no longer hurts to look at. And maybe that's enough. Maybe healing isn't about rewriting the past, but about deciding what we carry forward and what we finally set down. If this story stayed with you in some small way, you're always welcome here. This is a space where we listen, where we share, and where we try to understand a little more of what it means to be human. If you'd like to be part of that, you can subscribe and stay with us for the next story. And if you feel like it, you can leave a few words below. Sometimes even a single thought can mean more than we expect. Until next time, take care of yourself, and we'll be right here when you're ready to listen again.